Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if Trotsky came to power. We are of course talking about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union in its early days was very unstable and many fights of the Russian Civil War continued well into the 20s. Not only the Bolsheviks were fighting, but also many other groups such as the anarchists, the Green Army, the White Army, etc. Lenin was one of many Bolsheviks who fought in the war, and another important person who also fought in the war was Leon Trotsky. And he was not only fighting, but he was also leading several Red Army factions. What many people seem to forget is that Leon Trotsky was an Ukrainian-Jew and he lived in the city of Odessa, which was very international for Russian standards, as you had Germans, French, Greeks, Jews, Poles, even Turks, etc. living, working and studying in there. Trotsky, he was a very intellectual person and thus fluent in languages as of course Russian, Ukrainian and also even English, French and German, which is very often overlooked. Initially Trotsky was not a Marxist but a Narodnik. A Narodnik in this time was considered someone who was in favor of populist socialism, but then again it's a very broad description to describe this idea, but I would say that basically he would be, as a Narodnik, someone who supports the people. His first wife somehow managed to convince Trotsky to become a Marxist. And there is even this tiny point of divergence where we might even make an alternate history where Trotsky continued to be a Narodnik, but that's for another time. Due to his activities he was imprisoned and he also escaped many times. He lived outside of Russia and went to cities such as Berlin and Vienna. He was not always on Lenin's side, but I mean after you're coming back and you have everyone who is against you, you're forced to find allies that are somehow similar towards you. There are many ups and downs, and Trotsky is not a monotonous character, of course not. He's a very smart person, and it seems that he had the capacity to get people on his side. He was described as someone who could also be very charismatic, and I mean, if you could lead an army, then you were definitely someone who was worth of having power. So what if Trotsky came to power? After the Russian Civil War, and after the creation of the Soviet Union, Lenin ruled until his death. Lenin wrote a warning that Stalin would be dangerous, so instead of ignoring it like in OTL, Stalin would have an accident. Now, Trotsky will not just have immediate control over everything, but the biggest enemy would be out of sight. The secret police and the gulags had already started under Lenin, so they were still around under Trotsky, and also economically the Soviet Union would have more farm collectivizations in this alternate timeline as compared to OTL. So this would mean that under Trotsky there is a very high chance that something similar as the Holodomor will happen, but much earlier than in OTL. Unlike Stalin, Trotsky would not purge the army officers, as they were his power base and supporters within the party, but he would purge another class, the so-called bureaucrats. This would not happen from one day to another, of course, but after some time, and especially once the failure of the farm collectivization would become apparent. So you need to have a scapegoat, and in this case that would just be the Stalinists. And the Stalinists, they would all be these bad bureaucrats. Trotsky participated in the Red Terror, and the suppression of the Kronstadt rebellion showed that he was willing to destroy those that seemed very dangerous for him. Trotsky wanted to have some type of Soviet democracy where every district of workers would elect their own representative in the Council of the Soviet, but after some time it would become something similar maybe as the North Korean parliament in our timeline, given the fact that the population would just become too afraid to actually oppose Trotsky. The famine continues. People, in order to save themselves, tell how it was a saboteur that came along and destroyed everything of the farm, and a few show trials later and this becomes the standard excuse. Industrialization will still happen, and perhaps it might happen a bit earlier, as it was Trotsky's and not Stalin's main idea after all. With a more experienced military leadership and an industrialized country, the Soviet Union could choose to send more experts with the ammunition, with guns outside of their borders, to other countries to support communist uprisings. Sure, Trotsky, he was supporting a world where all the workers would unite, but certainly even someone like Trotsky, he would realize that the Soviet Union would not have the capacity to just send away a lot of money, and thus he would need to have another approach, which actually happened, for instance, in the Spanish Civil War, where Stalin sent also support in form of soldiers and machines and ammunition, guns, etc. Then there is this other fact which is very important for communism itself, especially from a Soviet point of view, and that's where they would, as a Communist Party, focus to make Germany turn red, and thus without Stalin the KPD and the SPD would be able to enter coalition, and with a much stronger communist presence, more moderate people will be convinced to join the Nazis, or maybe another faction that might be close to the Nazis, and certainly a civil war would erupt around the beginning of the 30s. So you will have a civil war in the 1931 or in 1932. France and the UK would not really intervene in this German civil war unless it would be to their disadvantage, and also because they were not really positive to risk another war, while Trotsky would send some experts to help the communist troops. Now we have Poland. Poland would have few options left. They could ally with their neighbors, and realistically they could only do so with Romania, as Czechoslovakia, Lithuania were not really in their favor. There was also the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union would plan to invade Poland, and Germany was in a civil war. And with that in mind, Poland would maybe reach out to Finland and even Japan, because the brother of Piłsudski, he was making research in the north of Japan with the Ainu tribes, so there is some chance that Piłsudski could reach out to Japan, and maybe Japan could accept. Whereas Finland shared in a similar way some type of the same fate as the Poles, so that might also help them to get Finland as an ally. With that in mind, Poland would also, as in OTL, push France to invade Germany, but France would again refuse to do so, and I believe that the Nazis could have an upper hand until the Soviet Union would decide to invade the Baltics and Poland. Well, with some luck, you would have Japan attacking Siberia, giving Trotsky some problems in the Far East, while Finland would still be able to fight on equal terms with the Soviets. The Baltics, they would be crushed, Romania would be overrun, and Poland needed to stubbornly defend their land. In a last frustration move, Piłsudski would offer the Nazis an alliance to crush communism together once and for all, and the Nazis, well, they themselves, they were also not in the most comfortable position. They would accept it despite their ideological beliefs. After some time, the Nazis managed to take control over most of Germany, except for East Prussia. Poland would lose almost half of their lands, along the line of the Wisła river, for instance. While the Soviets, they would suffer in the Far East, and this alternate World War II would thus be in full motion. Germany is weak and crippled. Poland cannot really make up for the strength, but at least from the Polish perspective, it's just a one-front war, and thus the morale could be much higher than in other times, for instance. Japan would not move much into Siberia, as they would not see it as a main advantage to do so, but they could secure important strategical points such as Vladivostok, for instance, and also territories that were connected to the Trans-Siberian railways. And they would also take a defensive approach and wait for the Soviet reinforcement to arrive. It is possible that France and the UK would intervene in this alternate World War II. A possibility could be that the Soviets would try to take out Persia, Iran, for instance, because they needed to have access to warmer seas, but because of doing so, they would clash with the interests of the Brits, and the Brits, they would then intervene to help Iran in a way. And so the Brits, they would now also fight against the Soviets, and with the Poles together, both could convince the French to intervene as well, but the French, they would really despise the fact to fight with the Germans on the same side. A Western victory is likely but not given, of course. Millions of people would still die, and due to the very spontaneous nature of the alliances that are existing in this alternate World War II, they would be very temporary, and we could not know how the world would change. It is very likely that the colonies could rebel with Soviet help, and I mean, if you get someone like Trotsky, he would probably exploit in one way or another the fact that the colonies feel mistreated by the motherlands, and thus communism could play some role in an anti-colonial movement for some time only, because after the West, if they would win in that scenario, communism would be forbidden and outlawed, while fascism would not be as much as discredited as it is today. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.